So good afternoon or good evening, everybody. So in this session, we are discussing the major synovial fluids as well as the major synovial joints, and their major characteristics. So as a reminder of what we discussed last time, how did we classify the different joints? Remember, we do have two factors that we rely on in order to classify the joints. Those are according to the degree of mobility of the joints. So we did classify the joints into immovable joints, slightly movable joints, or freely movable joints. So we've called the ones which are, you see on here on the slide, immovable joints. This is what we've called the synarthrosis. And slightly movable joints also are amphiarthrosis. And freely movable joints also would be the diarthrosis or diarthrotic joints. Another factors we've used to classify the different joints would be according to the material binding the bones together. We did mention that if I'm binding the bones together by connective tissue, this would be considered a fibrous joint. If I'm connecting the bones together by cartilage, this will be classified as a cartilaginous joint. And if I'm binding the cells, if I'm binding the bones together and those binding bones have a space in between and this space is going to be filled by synovial fluid, those joints will be classified as synovial joints. Major characteristics here that we're looking at in terms of synovial joints. First of all, the synovial joints will have articular cartilages. And remember, the type of articular cartilage that will be covering the articular surfaces of my bones forming the synovial joints will be hyaline cartilage. And those synovial joints will have a cavity, and this is what we call the joint cavity or the synovial cavity. And this is a small potential space between the articulating bones in which you're going to keep the synovial fluid. Inside of the joint cavity, you're going to have a fluid. This is what we call the synovial fluid. And why do you think you're going to have fluid in between the articulating bones in a synovial joint? We keep fluid in between the articulating bones simply for lubrication as well as to provide nutrition to the articular cartilage. If you remember, the cartilage is avascular, it doesn't have blood vessels, so it relies on getting nutrients and oxygen by diffusion from the surrounding tissues. And one of the surrounding tissues that will be providing the nutrients to the hyaline cartilage forming my articular cartilages will be my synovial fluid. So synovial fluid here gives the nutrients needed for the cartilage to survive. In order to contain this fluid inside the joint cavity, we need to be surrounding this joint cavity by a capsule. So if we're looking here, this is how a synovial joint will look like. So we have this potential space between the articulating bones. This is my cavity. And inside the cavity, you're going to have here, this is my fluid inside. This is my synovial fluid. And the synovial fluid is going to be formed of a filtrate of your plasma. And inside this filtrate, you're going to have large amounts of hyaluronic acid. To contain this fluid in between the articulating bones, you're going to be surrounding this cavity by a joint capsule. The outermost part of the joint capsule is going to be formed of fibrous connective tissue. This part is what we call the fibrous capsule. And the fibrous capsule, if you remember back from the tissue chapter, this was formed of dense irregular connective tissue. To the inside, to the inside of the fibrous capsule here, you're going to have a membrane, and this membrane is going to be my synovial membrane. And this is the membrane that actually going to be responsible for the formation of the synovial fluid. This is where the plasma will be filtered to form the synovial fluid circulating or located in between my articulating bones and the synovial joint. If you see on here, I can find cartilage covering the surfaces of my articulating bones. Those are my articular cartilages. Again, those are formed by hyaline cartilage. And if I have space between my articulating bones, so this means I am not fusing the two bones together by a cartilage or by fibrous connective tissue. So this puts the synovial joints at a high risk of developing dislocation, for example. I need to have something to support the synovial joints to prevent any dislocations that might be taking place because of the presence of this space between the articulating bones. So in order here to stabilize my joints, I will rely on three major reinforcements. What are the major reinforcements that I have in here? I have first a type of reinforcement that will be located inside of the joint capsule. This is gonna be my intracapsular reinforcement. I am located inside of the cavity. I'm located to the inside of the joint capsule, so I will call it an intracapsular reinforcement. Compared to this fibrous layer of the joint capsule here is also dense, gonna be attaching the bones together, supporting my joint, and this will be a capsular reinforcement because simply it's part of the joint capsule. So if I am formed by part of the capsule here to give the reinforcement, this would be considered a capsular reinforcement. And if we're looking here to the outside of the joint capsule and cavity, you're going to have tendons, ligaments, might be muscles that will be attaching the two bones articulating together. I'm attaching them together, providing extra support to the joint. This will be considered an extracapsular reinforcement. Why is it called extracapsular? Because simply it is located outside of the joint capsule. Another major characteristic here is that we're looking at in the synovial joints, that those synovial joints are rich in nerves and fibers. Nerve fibers and blood vessels. So I have lots of nerve fibers located in my synovial joints. Why do you think you need lots of nerve fibers? What kind of sensation are you detecting by your joints? Are you detecting any sensation in your joints? Yes, of course, many sensations. So if I close my eyes right now, I will know whether my wrist is flexed or extended, whether my forearm is flexed or extended. I know if I've got any things that causes harm to my joints, causing pain. I will be detecting this pain. I have the ability to detect the state of my joints, the location of my joints, whether those joints are flexed, extended, or whatever movements they are performing. And how can you detect all those sensations? You're gonna need to have large number of nerve fibers located within your synovial joints. And this also tells you why, for example, a person who has a defect in detecting sensations from his skin, from his joints, will need to keep looking at his feet as he's walking, because simply he relies on the vision to know the state of his joints. He relies on his vision to detect the degree of stretch of his muscles. He doesn't have the ability to know what is the position of the joints. And that's why here it's very important to get a lot of nerve fibers located inside my synovial joint. Moving on to how do I reduce the friction between the different parts sharing is the formation of the joint. So you're gonna have ligaments, like as we mentioned, attaching the bones together. We're gonna have tendons passing over the joint. We're gonna have lots of structures around those articulating bones. So every time you're gonna be moving, how come you do not irritate those tendons and ligaments but when you rub them against your bones? So if I have a bone like this, and every time I am contracting the muscle, the tendon or ligament will be rubbing over the bone. So why those tendons and ligaments will not get inflamed? Simply because between your ligaments and the bones which are moving, you're going to have flattened sheets of synovial membranes, and those sacs here, those flattened sacs will be filled with synovial fluid. So inside those sacs you can have synovial fluid. So try to imagine you have two things. One of them is moving all the time, which is your bone, and one of them is remaining in its normal place. So every time you're going to be moving your bone, you're going to be rubbing your ligaments. So in order to reduce the friction here between the ligament and my bone, so I would put here a sac filled with synovial fluid for me to reduce the friction between the bone and the ligaments. Same concept, same exact concept for my tendons. So if I have a tendon, every time I'm contracting a muscle, let's say my biceps muscle, I have the tendon like this. Every time I contract my biceps, I'm pulling my radius, and every time I pull my radius, I have some kind of friction between the tendon of the biceps against the trochlea, for example, of the humerus and other stuff. So how come this tendon will not get inflamed as you keep rubbing the tendon against the bone? Simply because those tendons will be surrounded by elongated sacs filled with synovial fluid that look exactly like the bursa, but those are called my tendon sheath. So if you see on here on the slide, you're going to see the bursae. Those are flattened fibrous sacs that will be located between your ligaments and the bone. And the tendon sheath here, this would be an elongated bursa that would be wrapping around the tendons. Alright, so moving on here to the next slide. So this slide shows how the bursa is going to be located in your joint. So for example, here I have a ligament that would be attaching my acromion to the coracoid process. This is what we call the coracoacromial ligament. And every time I move my humerus, the head of the humerus would be moving. And as I move the humerus, the head of the humerus here, it is supposed to rub against my coracoacromial ligament. So why I don't have an irritation here for the ligaments that will be in direct contact with the head of my humerus? Simply because in between the head of the humerus and my ligament, I will have a sac filled with synovial fluid. And this is going to be reducing the friction between the bone here and my ligament. Same concept on here in my tendon sheath. So you see here, those are elongated bursae, sacs filled with synovial fluids. This time they will be surrounding my tendon. So example here that we're looking at the tendon of the long head of the biceps. Every time you're going to be contracting your biceps, this tendon moves up and then down. So why you don't get an inflammation of those tendons? Simply because they are surrounded by sacs filled with fluid. This is again what we call the tendon sheath. Moving on to the different movements of the synovial joint. So first type of movements that I can perform by synovial joints will be a gliding movement. And a gliding movement is going to be taking place between flat surfaces. So if I have cube-shaped bones, like what I see on here, is a carpal, in between the carpal bones. So when you touch the carpal bones like this and you try to move your hand in the different parts of your hand, here you're moving your fingers, your hand from side to side, you get a feel that there is a slight gliding movement in between your carpal bones, your scaphoid, lunate, triquetral, pisiform, those carpal bones that we discussed before with the skeleton. So this kind of movement, is this taking place along any axis, along any plane? So is it taking place along my sagittal plane, for example, or along my frontal plane? No, it is just a short sliding motion that will be taking place between those flat bones. Alright, so I'm not moving along any plane here. It's not an angular movement to be considered. Alright? Another set of movements that can be performed by the synovial joints would be the angular movements. And angular movements can be taking place along either sagittal plane or the frontal plane. If you remember, what is sagittal plane? Sagittal plane is the plane that's going to be dividing here the body into a right part and a left part. Alright, so when you divide the body like this is a sagittal section. So if the movement is taking place like this along the sagittal plane, this will be either flexion, extension, flexion, extension. According to what will I say flexion or extension? According to what happens to the angle of the joint. So first most important thing that we need to pay attention to in here is where is the angle of the joint. So if I'm looking here on the slide, I'm looking here at the neck. Let's see, the angle is in front of the neck like this. If I have reduced the angle, so I'm moving down, so this is my angle now. This will be a flexion of the neck. So if you're reducing the angle of the joint, this means you are performing flexion of the joint. What if I did move backwards? So now the angle of the joint would be all this. Let me draw this in a different color. So the angle now of the joint is all of this. So now I did increase the angle of the joint, and when you increase the angle of the joint, this would be an extension. So again, if you're reducing the angle of the joint, this would be flexion. If you're increasing the angle of the joint, this would be an extension. What if I kept moving even beyond the normal movement of the joint? If again you're moving beyond the normal range of motion for the joints, this will be considered a hyperextension. If I'm performing extension beyond, again very important here, beyond the normal range of motion, so you don't normally do this, alright? This is a hyperextension, so beyond normal range of motion. Let's see another example on here. If I'm looking at the spine, this is my angle like this. When I read this, all this is the angle. If you did reduce the angle going down, so this is my angle now. So you see, this is the angle. So reducing the angle of the joint, this would be a flexion. What if I did move up like this? If I did move up, what happens to the angle of the joint? See all this now. So rather than, let's say, 120, it becomes 180 degrees. So this tell me what happens in here. Rather than 120, it becomes 180 degrees. This means I did increase the angle of the joint. And when you increase the angle of the joint, this would be an extension. What if I kept extending beyond my normal range of motion? If I go beyond the normal range of motion, this would be a hyperextension. Hyperextension. Another example here will be your shoulder. See here, this is the angle of the shoulder, like this. If you did move forward, what happened to the angle of the shoulder? So this would be the angle of the shoulder now. If you did move backward, like this, so all this will be the angle of the shoulder. So let's say this is 120, this is 180, let's say. Kept moving backward, more than 180. So what do we call when you increase the angle of the joint? This is a extension. What do we call when you reduce the angle of the joint? This is a flexion. Looking here at the knee, and some of you gets confused in terms of the knee movement. So the knee is different than the rest of the synovial joints that will be moving along the sagittal plane, because simply the angle of the joints is posterior, is behind. So if I'm moving here, my leg upward, what happens to the angle of the joint? Let's say it's 90 degrees. What happens when you move it down in this direction, forward? What happens to the angle on here? It did increase, so this is more than 90 degrees. So if I'm reducing the angles, this means I am performing a flexion, exactly. But if I am increasing the angle of the joint, this would be an extension. So reducing the angle of the joint, this would be flexion. Increasing the angle of the joint, this would be an extension. Another type of angular movement, but this time will be taking place along my frontal plane. And remember the frontal section back from chapter 1, this is the sections that will be dividing the body into an anterior part and a posterior part. So if I'm moving along this plane, so either I move towards the midline or away from the midline. Towards the midline or away from the midline. What we call the movement in which you're going to be moving towards the midline, this is an adduction. Try to imagine here. So you're moving your arm, for example, towards your body. So it's like adding your arm to your body. So this is an adduction. You add it. But if you're moving your arm away from your body, this will be an abduction. So adduction and abduction. Ab. This is an adduction, and abduction. Alright, so again, moving away from the midline, this is an abduction. If I'm performing like a combined movement, I am performing flexion here. Move this a little bit. Flexion, then abduction, then extension, then adduction, flexion, add, extension, add, flexion, ab, extension, add. What kind of movement am I performing here? This is what we call a circumduction. It's a combined movement of the angular movements along the sagittal plane and along the frontal plane. So it's combined between sagittal and frontal planes. Did you add another axis that you're moving along? Actually not. I'm still using the same two axes we did discuss. So either you're using frontal You're using frontal and sagittal at the same time. So you're not adding a new axis here. Rotational movements, this is a movement that will be taking place around the axis of another bone. So, like what rotational movements can I perform? Like the rotation here of the head from side to side. So how do you perform the rotational movement of the head? The atlas is going to be moving around the axis of the odontoid process of C2. Another rotational movement that can be performed is the medial rotation and lateral rotation of your arm and thigh. Moving on to special movements. The first special movement that we're looking at today is this would be the supination and pronation. What is the difference between supination and pronation? What bones are moving here? Actually, this is the radius rotating around the axis of the ulna. If the radius and ulna are parallel to each other, this is what we call supination. If you're going to be rotating the radius around the axis of the ulna, this would be a pronation. So special movements here be supination and pronation. Supination and pronation. Moving on to another kind of special movements, this time is going to be in the ankle. If I did move my foot upwards, this is my dorsiflexion. Dorso means towards the back. So if I'm moving my foot upward, I'm moving it towards my back. So this is a dorsiflexion. What if I'm moving my foot down towards the ground? See on here, I'm going down. And if my foot is going down, it's touching the ground, this is a plantar flexion. Plantar flexion. So how I do remember this plantar flexion? I remember plantar sounds like plants. So plants are attached to the ground. So when you perform a plantar flexion, you get closer to the ground. Go down. Downward movement is plantar flexion. Another special movement of the ankle joints, this would be the inversion and eversion. If you are turning the sole of the foot medially, creating a space between your foot and the ground towards the midline, if the space here between your foot and the ground is towards the midline, this is my midline on here, so this will be considered an inversion. If you have the space inside, you have an inversion. If I am turning the sole of the foot laterally, so I create the space here between the foot and the ground to the outside, away from the midline, this will be an eversion. So if you have the space outside, this is eversion. If you have it inside towards the midline, this will be an inversion. It's like this. If this is my foot on here, it creates a space inside towards the midline. So this is an inversion. Creates a space here outside, away from the midline. This is an eversion. Special movements of the mandible. If I have an anterior or forward movement of the mandible, this would be a protraction. Protraction. Backward movement of the mandible, this will be a retraction. Retraction. Opening and closing your mouth, this would be a special movement of the mandible. Here, if you're opening your mouth, this would be a mandibular depression of the mandible. You open the mouth. If you close the mouth, this would be a mandible elevation. So a good way to remember this. So when do you open your mouth? To eat. And when people eat the most? When they are depressed, right? So if I'm looking here, to a person who is depressed, eating a lot, so he opens his mouth, so he's not alone, he is also, his mandible also is going to be depressed. All right, so depression of the mandible is taking place to open your mouth. Special movement here of the thumbs. The thumb has the ability not only to perform flexion, extension, abduction, and adduction like the rest of the fingers. So you see here, if I'm looking at any of my fingers can perform extension, flexion, extension. I can move away from the midline, abduction. I can move towards the midline, adduction, abduction, adduction. Can do the same movements here in my thumb. If I'm looking here, flexion, extension, abduction, and adduction. Flexion, extension, abduction, and adduction. Alright, so what special movement can I perform here by my thumb? You see here, the thumb can touch the tip of the other medial four fingers. This is what we call opposition. Opposition. So remember, when the thumb opposes the medial four fingers, this is what we call an opposition. Moving on to the classification of the synovial joints, we will be classifying the synovial joints according to the shape of the articular surfaces. If I have two bones with flat articular surfaces, two flat surfaces articulating together, this is what we call a plane joint. Plane joints, they would be located like in here, between my carpal bones, like the joints that we're going to have between the patella and the patellar surface of the femur. Can you guess what kind of movement would be able to take place in between two flat surfaces? Can you perform flexion, extension between two flat surfaces? Can you perform abduction, adduction between two flat surfaces? You cannot. What kind of movement can I perform here by the plane joints? I can perform a gliding movement. Is this taking place along any of the planes, along the axis of the bone itself? Is it taking place around the axis of another bone? Is it taking place along the sagittal axis, along the frontal axis? What do you think? Is it taking place along any of the axes that we might have? Actually not. It's not taking place around or along any axis. So what this means? This means it's a non-axial joint. I will consider this joint a non-axial joint. So whenever you see plane joint, consider it as non-axial. Why it's non-axial? Because simply it's performing just a gliding movement. It's not moving along any axis, whether the axis of the bone itself or the axis of another bone or along a frontal or sagittal planes. Alright, so plane joints again are non-axial joints. If I'm looking here at our next type of synovial joints, those would be my hinge joints. And the hinge joint here, as you see, you have a cylindrical shaped bony structure and will be articulating here with another bone that has a concavity, like what you see here on the diagram. Like what example of hinge joint do we have? A very famous example of hinge joint in our body is going to be the articulation between the trochlea of the humerus and the trochlear notch of my ulna. You see here, this is the trochlea. It has a cylindrical shape, and the trochlear notch of the ulna, it has this concave shape. This is my, again, trochlear notch. What do you think is a type of movement that can be performed along hinge joint? So what do you think? What kind of movement can be taking place here in my elbow? I can perform flexion, extension. Can you perform abduction and adduction of your forearm as the elbow joint? You cannot. You cannot move your forearm by itself away from the midline or towards the midline. I cannot perform abduction, adduction. The only movement that can be performed by hinge joints, this would be a flexion and extension. And this tells you why I will classify the hinge joint as a uniaxial joint. It has only one axis it can move along. What is the axis I'm moving along? It's moving only along my sagittal plane. Moving on to another type of synovial joints, this would be my pivot joint, and the pivot joint is characterized by having two bones. One of them is going to be rounded, has a rounded end, and this rounded end will be articulating with a ring or a sleeve coming from another bone. Like a famous example here of a pivot joint, this will be the articulation between the radius and ulna. So the radius has a rounded end. This is the head of the radius on here. Let me draw this in a different color. Here, this is the head of the radius. And you're going to have this fibrous ring coming from the ulna. Can you remind me, what kind of movement do you allow because of the presence of the pivot joint here between the radius and ulna? What is the kind of movement did we perform just a few minutes ago? Due to rotation here of the radius around the axis of the ulna. So what kind of movement would this rotation result in? So remember, if you did rotate your radius around the ulna like this, this will result in pronation. So you're able to form a pronation and go back supination due to the presence of the pivot joint between the radius and the ulna. What do you think? How many axes is the pivot joint moving along? So the radius is rotating around the axis of the ulna. So how many axes I'm in use of? I'm using only one axis. So this would be considered what type of synovial joints? What do you think? Is this a non-axial? Is this a uniaxial, biaxial, multi-axial? If I'm telling you that the radius is rotating around the axis of my ulna, this means I'm having only one axis I put into consideration. So this will be a uniaxial joint. Moving on to another type of synovial joints in which I have two oval surfaces articulating together. One oval surface is going to be convex like this one, and the other oval surface going to be concave like the other side. If I have two oval surfaces, one convex and the other one is concave like this, what kind of movement can I perform? I can move along the frontal plane from side to side. I can move along the sagittal plane. So I can move along the sagittal plane. This means I will be able to perform flexion extension. I can move along the frontal plane, so I can move away from the midline or towards the midline, abduction and adduction. Alright, so this is what we call the condyloid or ellipsoid joints. So major example here of condyloid or ellipsoid joints would be the metacarpopharyngeal joints of your medial four fingers. So if I see on here, this is my metacarpal bone. It articulates with my proximal phalanx, and this articulation allows me to perform flexion of my finger, extension. It allows me to perform abduction. You see on here, abduction. I'm moving away from the midline in an anatomical position, and I can move towards the midline. This is an adduction. So here my finger, metacarpopharyngeal joint, will be responsible for flexion, extension, abduction and adduction. Alright, so again, what type of joint do I have in here? In the metacarpophalangeal joints of my medial four fingers, this will be an ellipsoid or condyloid joint. Again, how many planes do you think am I moving along? If I'm telling you I can perform flexion extension, I can perform abduction and adduction. What do you think? How many axes are you able to move along? You're able to move along frontal plane and sagittal plane. So this means how many axes am I moving along? I'm moving along 2 axes. So this joint will be classified as a biaxial joint. Biaxial, I have 2 axes. Moving on to a special type of joints. This is my saddle joint. And the saddle joint is characterized by having 2 articulating surfaces, and each one has a concave part and a convex part. So if we're looking here at the first articular surface on the slide, you're looking on here. First one has a convex surface. This part is my convex surface. And it has another part which is going to be concave. The second articular surface sharing in the formation of the saddle joint will also have a concave part. This is my concave part on the second articular surface. And I have also a convex part. So if we're looking here, we have 2 articular surfaces. Each one of them has a concave part and a convex part. What is the importance here? What makes it different from something like the condyloid or ellipsoid joint? Something like this. I have 2 oval surfaces, and each oval surface either is convex or it's going to be concave. What makes the saddle joint different than the ellipsoid joint? Here it gives me a wider and greater freedom of movement. And this is actually the type of joint that's going to be located here between the carpal bone and the first metacarpal bone. This is the carpo-metacarpal joint of the thumb. So this is the type of joint that allows me to perform an extra movement. What is the extra special movement that you can perform by your thumb and you cannot perform by the other medial 4 fingers? So you remember, all the fingers can perform flexion, extension, abduction, adduction. They can move along all the angle. They can perform all the different angular movements. But for the thumb, I was able to perform flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, but I have an extra special movement that I can perform is opposition. So what allows the thumb to get a greater freedom of movement here is the carpo-metacarpal joint of my thumb is going to be a saddle joint. Saddle joints allows you to have a greater freedom. Moving on to our last type of synovial joints, those will be my ball and socket joints. And it is so logical here. So can you guess how the articulating surfaces forming the ball and socket joints will look like? I'm called ball and socket. So it's simply one articular surface will look like a ball, and the other articular surface is going to look like a socket. Alright? So like what joints did we notice that the articulating surfaces, one looks like a ball and the other one looks like a socket, like the articulation, for example, between the head of the humerus and the glenoid cavity of my scapula. Head of the humerus and glenoid cavity of the scapula, one looks like a ball, the head of the humerus, and the other one looks like a socket where the head of the humerus will be articulating with. So this means what type of joint is forming my shoulder joint here is going to be my ball and socket joint. And the ball and socket joints is going to be allowing all the angular movements, so I can perform flexion, extension, abduction, adduction of my shoulder joint. Also, I can perform medial rotation, lateral rotation. I can elevate, depress. I have many movements. I can move along many axes. So what do you think would be the classification here of a ball and socket joints? Ball and socket joints would be classified as multi-axial joints. They have many axes, much more than two axes. They can move along, can perform rotation, they can perform flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, elevation, depression, all this, and gliding motion as well. So all this can be performed in a ball and socket joint. What is another example of a ball and socket joint? So some things that we're going to be discussing later on today. This would be, let me find here, another ball and socket joint that we're going to be discussing in more details later on today is going to be the articulation here between the head of the femur, and remember, what did we call the socket in the coxal bone to which the head of the femur is going to be articulating? Yes, exactly, this is my acetabulum. Acetabulum is the socket where the ball here is going to be the head of the femur. And those would share in the formation, as we all know, in the formation of the hip joint. Alright, and this completes our session for today, and we'll see you in the next session. Thank you.